My name is Helle Nielsen. I'm the Event and Marketing Coordinator at Interacoustics, and I want to welcome you to this webinar where today's subject is hearing threshold estimation using the auditory steady-state response. Now I will hand over the word to Mike Maslin. He is an international clinical trainer.
Okay, Helle, thank you very much for that introduction, and hi to everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time to tune into this webinar. Now, I was asked to give a talk today on the topic of the auditory steady-state response. So that's what we're going to focus our attention on for today. Now, the auditory steady-state response, if I just move on a slide, is it's a class of evoked potentials whose main clinical purpose lies in establishing the threshold of hearing. In other words, the quietest sound that someone can hear. And this particular technique is most useful in cases where the patient themselves can't provide a behavioural indication of their threshold. So, of course, the most common groups of these would be infants who are too young to cooperate on a conventional hearing test, or of course it might be other types of special populations such as adults with learning difficulties. And the main goal is of the procedure is to establish an estimated audiogram, so that if there is a hearing loss, then hearing aids can be fitted from an early stage based on this audiogram, and the outcomes for that individual should be maximised. Now, as you can see from this slide, I've broken my talk down into 3 sections. First of all, for the benefit of anyone just wanting to have a recap on the physiological activity of the brain that we're actually measuring, then I'm going to spend a bit of time just speaking about the principles of the ASSR. Then we'll just move our attention to some of the more practical aspects, and finally, all being well, from the technical point of view that Helle just mentioned, a quick demonstration of an ASSR. Now, as you can see from this slide, as I've defined, or should I say Ricard has defined the ASSR as a tendency, if you like, for neurons within the auditory system to send a steady stream of nerve impulses in response to an ongoing sound. And those nerve impulses can be then detected with sensors that are placed on the surface of the scalp. Now, if we fluctuate the sound in some way, such as by pulsing the volume off and on very rapidly, then the steady stream of nerve impulses that are going along the auditory nerve and through the auditory system, they will pulse accordingly, and then these pulses will then be reflected in our measurements. Now, if we step down the maximum volume that we use and then keep doing this until we can't measure a change in nerve activity anymore, measure the point at which the quietest sound at which that happens, then this will correspond to the hearing threshold. So it's an objective technique for measuring the sensitivity of the hearing system, of the auditory system, with the goal of creating an estimated audiogram. Now, before we move on to perhaps some of the principles of that statement, then I'd just like to clarify some potentially confusing terminology, which is, if you're in any way familiar with ASSR, then you'll know about this, but if you're not, then it's something to bear in mind. So this class of evoked potential is occasionally given different titles by different sources, different textbooks or websites, for example, or even different researchers and clinicians who are all actually referring to the same thing. And in particular, it can be confusing when the acronyms such as SSEP up here, steady state evoked potential, can be confused with other classes of evoked potentials such as somatosensory evoked potentials. These are evoked potentials arising from the sensation of touch, contact with the skin, and so it potentially can be very confusing. But to clarify, for today's talk, I'll be using the conventional and perhaps most informative title, which is ASSR, and this is the term used throughout the interacoustics family. Now, as a starting point, for anyone still a little uncertain about the definition of ASSRs that I just gave previously, then let's just delve into that concept a little more. So a useful starting point is to think about transient evoked responses. Now, in the very strictest sense of the term, an evoked response is any type of reaction to a sound, be it a startle reaction or a head turn or a button press when you're doing conventional audiometry, but that's in the absolute most strictest sense of the term, and these are of course those examples of just behavioural responses. Now, ordinarily when the term evoked response is used, it's almost certainly referring to physiological measurement of the bioelectrical activity within the brain, not a behavioural response. And the sources of interest to us are the auditory nerves and the neurons within the central auditory system, with a smaller contribution from hair cells within the cochlea. Now, a complication is that when we put electrodes on the scalp to measure activity, we don't just pick up bioelectrical activity from the auditory system, but we also pick up electrical activity from all the other neurons that are buzzing away inside the brain and doing their own thing, perhaps unrelated to auditory function, as well as potentially various other sources of bioelectrical activity from within the body. That would be, for example, muscular activity, that would be the EMG, electromyogram, electrooculogram, that's activity arising from the eye, potentially electrocardiogram from the heart, and if we're very unfortunate, we might also end up picking up external activity, for example, from adjacent electrical equipment. So, what this all means is that when we look to measure a transient sound, rather than just presenting a single instance of that sound, we need to record many instances and add those instances all together, such that all the unrelated bioelectrical activity will tend to cancel out in an averaging process and average out to zero. Whereas we'll be left with the response of interest, a series of voltage fluctuations representing the different neural processes evoked by the sound. And this slide here, this shows what some of these transient neural impulses might look like once we've completed that averaging process. Depending on the specific settings of the recording equipment and the stimuli that we use, we can focus on activity arising from the cochlea, and that would be electrocochleography, or it might be activity arising from the brainstem regions, and that's known as the auditory brainstem response, or of course it could be the activity arising from the cortex, cortical auditory evoked potentials. And all of these three examples that I'm showing here on the screen there, whilst they all differ in terms of where the precise neural generators arise, they do have one thing in common, which is that they represent discrete momentary responses to an auditory signal. The main reason why there happens just to be many of those auditory signals one after the other is just to resolve the signal from the noise. So that's transient evoked responses. Now let's just move on to auditory steady state response, because what if, instead of a brief sound that turned on and off discretely, with distinct gaps between each of those sounds, what if instead we continuously presented a sound so rapidly that the response from one stimulus hadn't even died out yet by the time the next stimulus came along? Well, then what we would get is we'd still get an evoked response to the sound, but the response would reach a continuous or steady state of activity instead of a discrete momentary response, and this is the auditory steady state response. And this can be visualized by this diagram on the right hand side of the screen. And if I just get the mouse pointer. Oops, sorry, it's gone forward a slide too much. So what we have here on the top of this diagram is over time the auditory signal, which can be seen to be fluctuating on and off in volume. Now this ringed area of the slide over here, which says AM 40 Hertz, this is indicating that the sound is fluctuating in volume on and off at a rate of 40 times per second. That's amplitude modulated at 40 Hertz. And then what we see at the bottom of the slide here is the corresponding auditory steady state response, and it falls into the same pattern. There's two ASSRs here, one laid over the other, and the ASSRs fall into the same pattern of fluctuation as the stimulus that evoked it, with the caveat that there is a slight delay, as I'm indicating here with the pointer, between the onset of the response and of course the onset of the stimulus. And that delay can be largely explained by the need for the sound signal to sort of propagate down the ear canal through the middle ear structures into the cochlea and then get transformed into nerve impulses. But what's interesting about this pattern of nerve activity that I'm showing on the slide here is that the two ASSRs are in phase with one another. In other words, the peaks and the troughs line up with one another. And they're both slightly out of phase, but by the same amount, with the stimulus. This is an important point, which which I'll come back to shortly. But for now, let's just satisfy ourselves that if the stimulus is pulsed 40 times a second, then the response will also pulse 40 times a second. And equally, if the stimulus was pulsed 80 or 90 times a second, etc., then the response should pulse by 80 or 90 times a second also. And this is the ASSR. Now, I'm just going to use these next few schematics to really try as hard as I can to make that concept very clear, because I think it's all important for understanding the clinical basis of the test. So what I'm showing on the slide here, on the left-hand slide is a sound. The left-hand side of this slide is a sound stimulus, and that would go through the cochlea, which is displayed schematically as if the basilar membrane were rolled out, with the base at the top of the slide and then the apex responding to the lower frequency sounds at the bottom of the slide. And the nerve endings of the auditory nerve connect to a characteristic place on the basilar membrane, such that each one has a characteristic frequency corresponding to that of the basilar membrane. Now, I've just displayed on this slide 4 neurons, which is obviously a gross oversimplification. There's many, many more than that. But the point is that the frequency place specificity is maintained from the basilar membrane to the auditory nerve fibers. So what this means is that if we play a high frequency stimulus, then this causes the basal end of the cochlea to vibrate, and then the corresponding nerve impulses from the nerve fibers that synapse with that part of the basilar membrane, as ringed here. Whereas if we move on and actually present a lower frequency sound, then it would be the apical portion of the basilar membrane that would maximally respond, and it would be the corresponding nerve fibers at that place on the basilar membrane that would convey that information, as ringed here. And now finally, I think this cartoon, and what we're showing here is a steady high frequency sound, and as a result a steady stream of neurons that are conveying that information to the central auditory system. If we move on a slide once again and we played a high and a low frequency sound, then the corresponding neurons would convey that steady stream of information to the central auditory system, and so on and so on. If we played a sound of intermediate frequency to stimulate these intermediate parts of the basilar membrane, then they should send the same stream of signals to the central auditory system. But what if we pulsed the volume of the sound stimulus on and off? Then the number of nerve impulses would wax and wane accordingly, and that's what gives rise to the auditory steady state response that I showed in the previous slide or two back ago. And that's what's illustrated on this slide. So rather than a steady volume, as I'm showing with the pointer here, if we modulate or pulse the volume of the sound up and down, then we'd expect the nerve impulses evoked by that sound to wax and wane accordingly. And this bottom trace shows a modulation frequency, in other words, the rate at which we're turning or pulsing the volume up and down. Now, if we were to analyze the spectral content of the stimulus, if we were to analyze a spectral content of the response, then what we'd see is a peak at the spectrum at the particular rate at which we varied the stimulus. So this process of analysing the spectral content of the response, spectral analysis, can be accomplished by applying a mathematical formula to the measured data known as a fast Fourier transform. That's one example. So notice how we no longer actually observe the waveform itself as we were doing earlier, but rather we're looking at the spectral content in its component parts. A simplified analogy would be that this is a little bit like taking a complex picture on the computer screen, breaking it down into its pixels, and then describing each pixel in terms of how red, green, or blue each one was. And in my example, we were varying the stimulus by 40 pulses a second, 40 hertz, and so what we see is a spike in the response at that corresponding frequency, 40 hertz, as I'm indicating on the slide there. Okay, let's just move on a little. Now, 40 hertz is just one example, and when we do play a 40 hertz sound, it typically emphasizes the response from the auditory cortex and thalamus. But if we were to pulse the sound at a faster rate, then this would typically favor nerve generators in the brainstem. The brainstem comes to dominate the response when we modulate the amplitude at around about 80 hertz. In this particular example, 90 hertz. And if we look closely, we can see the modulation frequency following the envelope of the response. And so if we were to now do the spectral analysis on the resulting neural activity from this stimulus, then you guessed it, we'd expect a peak, a spike in the energy, in the bioelectrical energy, in the spectral content at 90. And that's what's displayed on this slide. So again, on the x-axis we have the entire spectral content of the stimulus. On the y-axis we have the amplitude, how much energy is at any particular given frequency, and at 90, where we modulated the sound, we see a particular spike in the response. And this is a number. This is rather than subjectively analysing, for example, the morphology or peak picking the latency of a wave, we just get a number which can be compared statistically to all the other values at all the other frequencies. In fact, just a simple f-test can be used, which will tell you whether or not the value, the energy levels at 90 hertz is statistically significantly higher, which is of course our known modulation frequency, than any of the other frequencies in the signal. And so this is, of course, is a fully objective response. There's none of the subjective interpretation of waveform shape or peak picking as you might see in a conventional ABR, which gives us a very definite yes or no answer. Arguably one of the most important advantages of ASSR. Now, what I'm showing on this next slide is a further step in our understanding. Now, if we pulse the nerves at a particular modulation frequency, in this example it was 90 Hz, and we'll call that our fundamental frequency, then there will also be energy at harmonics of that fundamental frequency. One particular standout feature of the Eclipse system is that it takes advantage of the presence of these harmonics in order to increase statistical power. And therefore that's advantageous because it can reduce test time and give us increased certainty of whether or not there's a response present or absent. Now, a harmonic is just an integer multiple of the fundamental frequency. So in this example, our fundamental was 90 Hz, that was our modulation rate in this example. And so if that was the case, we'd expect harmonics at integer multiples increasing in steps of 90 Hz. We'd expect energy at those frequencies, which is induced by the auditory signal. And so we can expand our f-test to take into account these higher harmonics and give us increased statistical confidence. So one way to perhaps think of this is a bit like increasing the signal-to-noise ratio, because if we just consider the fundamental frequency and not all the harmonics, then we're treating those harmonics as noise unnecessarily, really, when really they're actually part of the signal. So this approach, by accounting for them in our statistical analysis, that avoids that pitfall. Now I'd just like to move on to phase detection. Now, phase detection is the third string in the bow, if you like, of the way in which the Eclipse system analyzes the ASSR. And it makes an assessment of the phase of the response. Now, what I'm showing here on the right-hand side of the screen are some hypothetical auditory steady-state responses. And there's perhaps 4 or 5 just overlaid with one another right there. And we can see that the peak of each response lines up with the peak of all the others, which means that they're in phase with one another. But what we also, if you cast your mind back to one of those earlier slides, what we also know is that although they're in phase with one another, they're slightly out of phase with the signal that evoked them, the sound signal, because there's a slight delay by the sound needing to propagate through the auditory, through the ear canal and through the middle ear system and so on. So the signal, these various ASSRs are overlaid with one another and in phase with one another, but out of phase by a set amount with the signal. And this set amount in this particular example is 60 degrees. So just a little bit of a delay between. If the signal was, for example, in phase with the response, then we'd see the dot and the line come round to 0 degrees to show that they were in phase. But there's a slight phase lag, meaning the response is slightly behind the signal. And this dot here that I'm highlighting, this might represent one of these ABRs, one of these ASSRs, and the position of the dot and the length of the line would indicate the amplitude, the size of that ASSR. Now, if we were to then overlay all of these other ones that I've shown here, then we'd expect a cluster of dots to form in this vicinity, because they're all in phase with one another, but out of phase by around about the same amount with the signal that evoked them. So what we can do is we can have a look to see how closely clustered our ASSRs are on a polar plot, and that will tell us whether or not they're in phase with one another and how much out of phase they are with the signal. And this phase coherence analysis can then be used to determine whether or not the likelihood of that clustering was by chance or due to some phenomenon that we've evoked in terms of the sound. In this example, I've shown a series of random instances of activity at a particular frequency of interest. It might be 90 Hz, for example, but these responses are all out of phase, which means there's no clustering. Each one is represented by a particular line and a dot, but they're not clustered anymore because they don't overlap with one another as you would expect them to overlap if it was evoked by a sound always occurring with the same delay. So if we now just compare those two examples side by side, on the left here's an instance of random noise at the particular frequency of interest plotted on a polar plot, and they seem to be random instances of noise, because each particular instance that I'm just pointing at doesn't seem to be in any way related to any of the others. Whereas on the right hand side of the screen, they're all clustered together and they all seem to be overlapping, which is just what you'd expect if there was something under our control that was driving that response, in this case the sound, of course. So what we can do, in addition to the amplitude spectra and measuring the presence and absence of the fundamental and harmonics, we can also run a further statistical analysis to determine whether or not this pattern of clustering could have occurred by chance, or the likelihood of it not occurring by chance. And those are the three components of the statistical response detection algorithm that the Eclipse system relies on, and really sets it apart in terms of sensitivity from perhaps earlier generation devices. Now, so that's all I'd like to talk about in terms of the response analyses and the principles of the test. Let's move on to the threshold estimation itself, and we'll just spend a few minutes on this and then get on to our demo. So I've just shown this slide here to illustrate the electrode montage. It's the same conventional montage that you might use for ABR. So one electrode on each of the mastoids, one electrode on the midline at the high forehead position, and then the ground electrode and low forehead position. Now, in terms of the response magnitude from the brainstem at least, and arguably from the cortex as well, the biggest amplitude ASSR would arise if we actually placed the non-inverting electrode on the vertex where I'm pointing to now. But in the population of interest, which I mentioned earlier is of most interest, arguably, which I mentioned earlier is infants, then occasionally this leads to impracticalities, particularly if the fontanelle hasn't closed, if it's a patient of an early developmental age. And so, by convention, we sacrifice a little bit of amplitude by moving the electrode forward, but it's a lot easier to place the electrode on the forehead, away from the hair and other complications. So that's the montage that I'm using today. And the first step in the audiologist procedure, of course, would be, once they've applied the electrodes in the usual fashion, would be to check impedance. We're looking for balanced impedances between all four electrodes, with ideally the absolute values below 3 kilo ohms. And just out of interest, in case you're wondering, I am currently around about 0.7 on my montage, so I think we're good to go there. Now, what I'm displaying here is a screenshot of what the actual software for the Eclipse ASSR module looks like. And one thing that I haven't discussed in detail yet, we've focused on the response, the ASSR, from one modulation rate of one pure tone. But if we have slightly different modulation rates, then we can play lots of pure tones simultaneously. Conventionally, you might have, for example, around about the 80 Hertz ASSR, you might have some responses at, say, 84 Hertz, 92 Hertz, 105 Hertz, slight variations from one another, but such that we can look at the fundamental frequency for each one of those modulation rates, and each one will be carrying a different pure tone to the ear, and also its corresponding phase and harmonics. And what this means is that we can stimulate the two ears together, if we should so wish, and we can also stimulate several frequencies for by convention in each ear simultaneously. Now, the other thing that I haven't really talked about so much so far, and I'll just take a minute to mention it now, is the narrowband chirp that the Eclipse system uses. So the conventional the more conventional amplitude modulated tones that we were discussing earlier, they're not used by the Eclipse. Rather, it uses the narrowband chirp, which is, if you'd like to, I won't go into much detail into the theory of that. If you'd like to read more about it, then I'd point you in the direction of the Into Acoustics Academy website, where there's various links and related articles which discuss that stimulus. But in short, it's a type of stimulus which provides us with maximal stimulation of all the neurons that are represented around each of the carrier frequencies simultaneously. So maximal neural synchrony at each of these carrier frequencies at any given time. Now, if we just zoom in a little bit on one of those panels representing one of the stimuli, in this case it's 4 kilohertz to the right ear, then what we've got along the x-axis is time, and then y-axis is our confidence in the presence or absence of a response. And for each particular run, we'd choose a level, and then we'd play the sound until such time as we decided with a particular given statistical confidence that there was a response present, and then we'd move on to another threshold, and so on and so on, and we'd track down in terms of the overall volume of the particular carrier frequency until such time as we could no longer detect a response. And the lowest level at which we did detect a response, that would be our threshold, and then that would be treated with a correction factor, because we're talking we're measured in dB NHL here, so we'd convert that with a correction factor to go on an audiogram. Then it would be known as dB EHL for estimated hearing level, and from that point we could move on to the hearing aid fitting process if that was so necessary. And the final thing that I'd just like to point out on this slide is this greyed out area here. This provides us with an indication of how much residual noise is in the signal, and for us to be sure of a signal being present, then we would like to have a response present with low residual noise at threshold, a response present with low residual noise just above threshold, and a response absent with also low residual noise just below threshold as well. Now there are certain probably locally derived criteria for what constitutes low residual noise in terms of the National Health Service in the UK, where I'm from. Although there's no official recommended procedure, the suggested level of residual noise for infants is anything below 10 nanovolts, but for adults perhaps slightly more acceptable to take a higher level of 15 nanovolts. Okay. And then here, this slide just illustrates the actual estimated audiogram that can be derived. So once we've completed all the measurements that we'd like to on each of the 4 points for each ear, we're plotted these grey points here, showing the level in dB NHL of the ASSR, and then the coloured points show the corrected values. Correction factors applied to take into account things like age, and depending on how the data is gathered, it might be gender and maturational issues as well. But in any case, we're left with an estimated audiogram, which can then be used directly with the software to fit hearing aids as when necessary. In terms of the role of the audiologist, well, of course, a lot of the things that I've talked about so far have been rather automated, in that all the response detection, is carried out by an algorithm. But the direction in which the test goes at any particular given time is monitored in a sort of in a live fashion by the audiologist, who might decide whether or not a stimulus level needs to be increased or decreased, whether the stimulus rate needs to be changed. For example, if a subject moves from a rested to a more agitated state, and also, of course, putting the results into wider context of case history, and perhaps of course the point might be reached where the audiologist decides that an entirely new test is warranted instead of further ASSR testing. So the role of the audiologist is still making all of the key decisions, but the subjectivity of whether or not a response present or absent, the subjective nature of that component is removed in ASSR. Okay, so this brings us on to the moment of truth, when we're going to have a little live demonstration. So I'm just going to switch your screens over to my Eclipse system. So what you can see here is the ongoing EEG activity from myself. Now, of course, under ideal circumstances, you wouldn't be measuring a response from yourself while sitting up and talking over it and commentating. But for the purposes of this demonstration, it will suffice. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw your attention down here to where it says the stimulus rate. I'm using a low rate for myself in this case because obviously I'm an active, awake adult. But if you had a child who was typically restful, or perhaps an adult who was also restful, then you might be tempted to use a higher modulation frequency. But for the purposes of this demo, we'll measure from the 40 Hz response coming from the thalamus and the cortex. And I'm just going to talk you through some of the setup parameters that I've already input so that I can hear what's going on. I'm just going to measure responses from my left ear, and I'm not going to measure responses from my right ear so that I can continue talking to you. The response, just excuse me one moment. The stringency with which we accept a response can be altered between 95% and 99% confidence as to whether a response occurred by chance or as a real event. So if we just for the purposes of the demonstration, we'll just select the slightly less stringent response. And finally, another thing that would not be ideal normally is the use of the 80 microvolt rejection level. Ideally, you'd want that much lower. For an adult, perhaps rejection levels of 20. But again, as I'm sort of sitting upright, we're just going to make do with slightly more noisier responses in the interests of just showing the procedure. So what we're going to start here is globally for my left ear. We're going to play a chirp sound in at each of these carrier frequencies at 65 dB NHL. And if I press start, now I'm just going to be quiet for a while, but what we'll see on the right hand side of the screen here is the responses resolving against the noise, which will be shown. Noise will be shown in grayed out area at the back. Okay, I'm just going to put the test on pause there so that I can comment on what we've got so far. So as we can see, the carrier frequencies of 4 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, and 1 kilohertz. Within a minute of the test, even when I was sitting upright and awake and moving, within a minute reached 100% confidence in the response being there. And we had the criteria set to 95%. So what this means is that we've satisfied 100% of the criteria for a statistical test that is 95% sensitive. And so there's a 5% chance that these responses at these carrier frequencies could have occurred by chance in terms of the phase, coherence, and the presence and absence of the fundamental and harmonic, and a 95% chance that that was due to me having heard the sound. We didn't reach so much of a clear response, of course, in the 500 hertz condition, where neural synchrony is a little bit less. And it's possible that had we gone on and tested for the whole 6 minutes, we may have gone on an upward trajectory. Who knows? But you can see in each of the cases, the residual noise was dropping. In the best case here, we had the residual noise, interestingly, for the 500 hertz signal at 65 nanovolts, and then at 77, and so on for the others. So what that means is that if we had a criterion of 15 nanovolts, which is what I mentioned earlier, then we couldn't really classify these as thresholds. We'd have to classify them as inconclusive until we got the residual noise ratio down, which might be the case with just subsequent testing. And then, but what would happen is, once you get to this point, for example, with these, while we're recording at 500 hertz and continuing to gather data to obtain a response at 65 here, there's no need to wait with this system for these other carrier frequencies 1, 2, and 4. There's no need to wait for them. We can select individually, for example, by right-clicking on this 1000 hertz, and we could then decide as an audiologist, if we're happy that there's a response present at 65, we might decide to come down by 10 dB or 20 dB, even step sizes, and continue to measure a response there, so that in order to make our test most efficient, everything is being recorded at the fastest possible pace. Okay. Well, I think that's all of the key things that I wanted to discuss using the demo, and perhaps it's wise that I just sort of quit while I'm ahead, other than just to draw your attention, if you weren't already aware, to this this audiogram up here. And for the 3 responses where we think there might be a response present, the system has already plotted them at 65, and then the estimated hearing level, the corrected hearing level just below, which can be adjusted over here according to whatever criteria you might have held in the database. Of course, these particular values at 65 would be updated if we were to go on and measure responses at lower levels, and so on. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is switch back to PowerPoint now. There we go, it's back. Okay, so I hope you can see this screen again, the slides. But that was everything that I wanted to talk about today. So hopefully that's satisfied our goals of introducing ourselves to the principles of the auditory steady state response. In particular, the nature of the relationship between the stimulus and the response itself, and the way in which the response is analysed in the Eclipse system, and then a brief overview of some of the clinical considerations that an audiologist might bear in mind, as well as a very brief demo of the data being gathered. Now, I will invite Helle to resume the presenter mantle, because I think she's going to just take questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mike, for a great presentation. Yeah, it's time for questions and answers. If you have any, then please write them in the instant message box on the left of the screen.